The purpose of this documentary is to inform citizens about the troubling consequences of school choice in the Indiana K-12 public education system. Through interviews with key stakeholders, it demonstrates how school choice policies enable discrimination against and segregation of students. In addition, it provides evidence that charter schools and vouchers, paid for with public tax dollars, allow for little accountability from elected officials and have a negative impact on the public schools. And public schools, after all, are one of the fundamental institutions of a democratic society, intended and obligated to serve all. Public schools hold out the promise and possibility of equity, justice, and racial and social equality.
I'm going to go ahead and show you how you can turn just words into a whole stretched out sentence about polar bears.
I think the benefit of public school is that it takes everybody, and it doesn't matter who you are or what your background is or beliefs or sexual orientation or, we welcome everybody. I think that one of the biggest strengths of public education is the diversity that we bring in. That was the biggest part of my education, I think, was learning how to interact with people who weren't like me. And I think as a nation and as a planet, I don't think we have any hope of surviving if we can't figure out how to coexist with people who don't think like us. And I think that the voucher and charter system works against that.
School choice, in the form of private school vouchers and charter schools, was supposed to make education work for everyone in Indiana, but it hasn't delivered on that promise. Expanded school choice has robbed public schools of students and funding. It hasn't consistently helped children. It has funneled hundreds of millions of public dollars to schools that can discriminate. And it has undermined the notion that public schools are a cornerstone of democracy, that schools should unite communities, not divide them.
Our children in our schools are Indiana's children. Children that we educate are all of our children. And yet we've allowed a system to be created that has been very divisive and has really pit different communities, different school systems, different school configurations against each other. And that's not good for children.
I've said this time and time again at our Senate Education Committee meetings. I think the expectation of a lot of the educational reform policies does not yield the outcome that folks anticipated that it would.
The way that we talk about public education today has really changed as the way we talked about it when I was growing up, and certainly when the founders were were establishing the nation. Ultimately, education has always been that thing that we build a democracy on, that we sort of lift people up. But in the last decade or so, we've begun to talk about public education as though it was the problem rather than the solution. So this idea that we are trying to take away or sully a bedrock of our democracy is really concerning for me.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racially segregated public schools were unconstitutional. The decision provoked massive resistance. Communities came up with a novel method to avoid integration: school vouchers. Some, like Prince Edward County, Virginia, closed their public schools.
In 1959, it finally happened. When the courts ordered immediate desegregation that September, Prince Edward did what no county in America had ever done. It closed its public schools.
In 7 southern states, white students received publicly funded vouchers to attend all-white private schools, called segregation academies.
And they gave to every student a voucher and said, you can attend wherever you want to attend. And so for, I think, a period of about 4 years, there were no public schools in the public high schools. They made it very clear in that process that there were schools that would be white schools and there would be schools that would be black schools. At one point in time, over 750,000 students had attended segregation academies in various states across the South.
It's important to think about this question historically as well, that when you go back into the time after Brown versus Board of Education, school choice was initially held up and used in a number of states as a way to avoid integration. So it has segregation roots, and so that's important to remember.
Today, private school vouchers are back, but again, not for everyone.
My book, Overturning Brown, investigates what is today a well-financed, growing private school movement called school choice. And its advocates claim that they are advancing civil rights by promoting and urging states to adopt school voucher programs that send taxpayer money to private schools, often unregulated private schools. These voucher programs, in fact, are quite similar, are exactly the same as the voucher programs which were first started by the Southern segregationists in the 1950s and 1960s in order to defeat the U.S. Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. Not much has changed since the days of the Southern segregationists who created the original voucher programs. What has changed in a major way is the reach and size of government support. Today, we have 27 states, 11 in the South and 16 in other parts of the country. The states with voucher programs spend more than $2.1 billion each year, and that number is growing. They're growing with a legacy of the Southern segregationists.
With Indiana's Choice Scholarship Program, families receive state-funded vouchers to help pay tuition at private schools, including religious schools. Those schools aren't supposed to turn students away because of their race, but they can and do exclude students because of their religion, disability, and sexual orientation.
We looked at what do state laws say with regard to voucher programs. What do their anti-discrimination provisions say? And we were shocked to find that most of them followed Indiana. What Indiana had in place, where they provided protections based on race, but not necessarily language. I don't believe any of them had protections for language, for English language learners, and the protections for students with disability, sexual orientation, gender identity were really lacking in most of these state voucher laws.
And Zoe Savitsky, who was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, said it best when she said to me that the further away from public schools our children get, the less we are able to protect them. And that's certainly true, right? If we're talking about public schools, we have due process for discipline, we have, equal protection for race and gender and other matters. We have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based upon race. We have Title IX that deals with issues of equality in regard to race, gender, etc. We have the Equal Education Opportunities Act, which protects English language learners. We have the IDEA, which guarantees free and appropriate public education for students with disability. But the point is, none of that applies in the private sector. None of it. Not a single one of those laws that I just listed to you applies in the private sector.
Some evangelical Christian schools require families to sign a statement of faith that condemns homosexuality along with some secular behavior and beliefs.
Well, they can absolutely discriminate based on religion because they can require you and your family to subscribe to the religion. I mean, I've looked at some of their handbooks, and it's very religious language. It's very explicit, and I think we're so used to accepting that. But the problem is now it's public money that's propping up the religious schools.
You know, it's interesting because Indiana pats itself on the back and says choice for all, and I hear that a lot, but really in reality it's access for some, and that is not the same. And so what is quite frustrating is enrollment and mission policies that allow for that type of discrimination, employment that allows for that. That again, when tax dollars are going to support those entities, there should be more guardrails put on that. That, in my opinion, is unacceptable.
The most disheartening thing for me is when we have families who have a child with a disability who will come to the MSD of Wayne Township and enroll and share with us that they tried to enroll in another school setting that told them, I'm sorry, we can't service your child. We don't have those services to provide to your child. You cannot attend here. We don't have that option, and quite frankly, I'm glad that we don't. In traditional public schools, we serve all. And we open our arms and welcome those families. We welcome those students who have disabilities. We find a way to work through the case conference committee to provide them the services necessary so that we can take care of whatever that challenge is that they bring to us and to work to overcome that or to work through that to help them to grow as much as they possibly can.
The Indiana Constitution prohibits giving state money to religious institutions. But the Indiana Supreme Court ruled that vouchers were legal in its 2013 Meredith v. Daniels decision. The court reasoned that vouchers were awarded to students and families, not to the private schools. It said any benefit the school received was not direct, but incidental.
Well, that's a load of hooey, and it's just an argument around the fact that we are sending money to parochial schools, but we found a way to, or at least an argument, to say that we're giving it to the parent who then takes it to whatever school they want to go to.
We don't believe that the state, that any government actor should sanction that type of discrimination, period. And despite what the Indiana Supreme Court decision says, we believe philosophically that when you as an entity accept public funds, as these voucher schools do, that they ought to be held to the exact same standards with respect to discrimination, with respect to academics, with respect to admission policies, as any other school, public, charter, what have you, that accepts those public funds.
Voucher schools can also discriminate in hiring and firing. Recently, Indianapolis Roncalli High School fired 2 longtime guidance counselors because they were in same-sex marriages. The school has received $8.6 million in state vouchers.
I was shocked. I was shocked. I was hurt. I couldn't understand. I couldn't fathom who would want to come after me in that way, who would so intentionally want to hurt my family and myself. But I think that the piece personally for me that impacted me the most was that I had been in that community for more than 35 years. I grew up in the diocese. I went to Roncalli. I stayed an active alum even when I was in college and had moved away. And when I moved back and had started my counseling career at Roncalli, I was always who I am, unapologetically. I didn't, I hung around with people that worked at Roncalli. I hung around with administrators and teachers. I was an active part of the community, as was, my daughter, and my entire family is an active part of the community. So what was wrong to me personally at first was how could they not protect me? How could they not back me? How could they not come to bat for one of their own?
For all those 38 years, there was no issue. And then suddenly, the 39th year, I wasn't doing anything differently. It became an issue.
The counselors have taken legal action against the school and the Archdiocese.
Because discrimination is wrong. And it had an impact not only on Lynn and her family, but imagine what it would be like to be a gay student at Roncalli and to see what the Archdiocese and the school was doing to the faculty. It's important to bring this case not just for Lynn, but for the students in the school and for all Catholic school teachers across the Archdiocese. I think that an institution or organization that accepts public funding ought to be required to comply with the law. The state of Indiana is giving them money, and the state of Indiana says same-sex marriage is legal. And I think there's a huge disconnect there.
You can't have it both ways. You can't cloak yourself in being a private institution entitled to run your organization as you see fit, where at the same time removing that cloak and inviting in the outside world to support you with their tax dollars. You're either one or the other. You're not both.
The legislature needs to change the law to prohibit voucher accepting schools from engaging in this type of discrimination. And it would be a matter of going in and amending the code, taking out those provisions that do allow the voucher schools to engage in that type of discrimination.
Catholic Church and the Archdiocese has a decision to make. They can either continue to discriminate or they can receive voucher dollars, one or the other. I'm not telling them what they can and can't do.
A state legislator tried to do just that in 2019. Here's what happened.
This is a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves. Is it discriminatory for Christian congregations to live out their sincerely held moral beliefs, which they have held for thousands of years?
I just want to point out that this debate we're having right now is a textbook example of why it was ill-advised to go down this path of providing tax-funded vouchers to religious-based schools. You could feel the temperature rising, tempers flaring, and we're debating religious doctrine down here in the well of the House. Why are we doing that? Because our tax dollars are funding schools that are operated based on the religious tenets of various churches and congregations. And yes, I would understand why many people here might be offended, say, why is the state trying to interfere with the religious doctrines and beliefs of a religious institution operating a school? You know what? I get that, and I have some sympathy for that. But you have to recognize that I hear from constituents who are also offended. They say, why is it that my tax dollars have to go to fund schools operated based on religious beliefs that I don't agree with? So we're in a big mess, and we have to decide. And I don't like making the decision. I don't like telling the Catholic Church how to run their operation. I wish I didn't have to do it. I don't want to do it. But you know what? They're taking my constituents' tax dollars to run their schools. And my constituents are asking me to provide some accountability and to at least have them follow basic policies about not discriminating. And so now that I'm forced into this position, I feel I have no choice but to support this amendment, because I think that we need to have at least some baseline adherence to some rules of non-discrimination if we're going to hand out our tax dollars to religious schools.
In 2020, State Senator J.D. Ford introduced legislation to prohibit discrimination by private schools that receive voucher funding.
My bill prevents any school that discriminates against its teachers, staff, or students from receiving state taxpayer dollars. This includes discrimination based on race, disability, color, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, national origin, religion, or ancestry.
It is most encouraging to think that possibly in the future, if this bill passes, no student will have to be put in the same situation as me. A situation which undeniably took away my right to a proper education and left me with a feeling of fear, clouding my every school day, wondering who would be the next victim to discrimination.
But the Senate Education Committee didn't give Senator Ford's bill a hearing. Governor Mitch Daniels had long expressed hostility toward public schools. In a 1996 TV conversation hosted by future Governor Mike Pence, he accused them of abysmal, atrocious failure. In 2011, Daniels and the Republican-controlled legislature joined to remake K-12 education, and they created the Choice Scholarship Program, which provides vouchers to help pay tuition at private schools, nearly all of which are religious schools.
When parents are given the questionnaire asking them why it is they're choosing to use a voucher to attend a private school, the number one reason across the board is for religious purposes, which in my mind flies in the face of the philosophy of our Indiana Supreme Court decision indicating that this really was just an individual parent choice based upon where they wanted to send their child rather than giving public taxpayer dollars directly to a religious institution.
I was a single mom and really wanted my children to have a firm foundation, a biblical worldview, so to speak, and to have it at church, at home, and at school. And so when vouchers became available, I was probably one of the first voucher parents. And it allowed me to no longer have to pay full tuition for my children, which was a huge financial break for me.
Daniel said students should attend a public school for a year to qualify for a voucher.
As this bill was finally crafted, the public schools will get first shot at every child. That is to say, the family will only be eligible if the child has spent at least 2 semesters in a public school. And you may agree or disagree with this, but I think it's a worthy inclusion into this piece of legislation. In other words, the public school, if the public school delivers and succeeds, no one will seek these to exercise this choice. But neither will we incarcerate any family's kid in a school that they don't believe is working, having tried it at least 1 full year.
But under Indiana's next governor, Mike Pence, the program changed and grew, eventually serving over 36,000 students in more than 300 private schools.
When the program was initially rolled out, it was really a program that was meant to be, the intent from what I know of, was for low-income, at-risk students who were in failing schools to have maybe a better opportunity. And so fast forward now to today, the largest growing users of that program, or those taking advantage of it, are suburban families, they're white students, and there is $75,000 or more annual income.
And I've quoted Governor Daniels many times when I've testified before the legislature arguing against the provisions that have been stripped out of the original voucher legislation requiring that 1 year in public school. Back then, you only had a couple of different avenues for students to be able to use a voucher and go to a private religious school or a private voucher accepting school. Now we have 8 different avenues for students to receive a voucher and go to a private school. And the requirement that students first attend a public school for a year really no longer exists.
Indiana's charter school program dates from 2001 and was greatly expanded 10 years later. Charter schools, which are usually nonprofit, are publicly funded but privately operated. They can be authorized by colleges and universities, by the Indianapolis Mayor's Office, and by a state charter school board. In exchange for exemptions from many state laws and regulations, a charter school is bound to a contract, or charter, between the school's organizer and the school's authorizer.
Many of our legislators philosophically thought we were behind on moving forward with renovation, or not renovation, but reform of our education system. So, and they brought forth the argument that charter schools would be innovation incubators, and that they would offer creative opportunity for diversity in curriculum and programming that could be customized for children, and that by freeing up charter schools from many of the regulations that tie the hands of traditional public schools, that charter schools would be free to navigate more nimbly to create these incubators of innovation. And it's certainly debatable now, 18 years later, whether that has really transpired or not.
11 charter schools opened in Indiana in 2002, the first year for charter schools in the state. For the 2020 school year, there are about 100 charter schools serving over 44,000 students. Some charter schools have done a good job, but others have struggled. And charter school authorizers have the power to shut down charter schools that do not meet the terms of their contracts. A study by the Network for Public Education concluded that, nationwide, half of all charter schools closed within 15 years from when they were founded, and more than 867,000 students were enrolled in charter schools that closed between 1999 and 2017. Tanya Batts, in addition to being a former voucher parent, taught at an Indianapolis charter school.
It was a school that was opened in a impoverished area of Indianapolis on the far east side. Lots of discipline issues and high teacher turnover. But some of the most brilliant minds that you ever want to encounter in some of the students, lots of students that needed one-on-one interaction in order to discover that they could do it because they came from traditions where a teacher, or they may have felt like they couldn't accomplish. Students maybe just needed someone to say, hey, you can do this, or because they've never been told that before.
In the spring of 2019, school leaders announced her school was closing.
The students were devastated. So you go to school and there was no indication that the school was going to close. Matter of fact, we were on a school improvement plan mandated by the board, and the trend was ticking up. We were making improvements, and we had the teachers were convened to, that morning, and we were told the school was closing. The board was going to meet that afternoon, and by the end of the day, letters went out to the students without warning, without an opportunity to adjust.
I actually went to the principal and talked to her about the school. I kind of did it like every other day. And I talked to the teachers about it, but they said it was nothing we could do about it. A lot of us was angry.
Public schools in the U.S. grew more racially integrated after the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Unfortunately, that trend has reversed in the past 30 years. Research has found, moreover, that school choice exacerbates school segregation. A study led by the Dean of the University of Kentucky School of Education found charter schools increased segregation. And an Associated Press analysis found students in charter schools were more racially isolated than students in other public schools.
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence and some empirical evidence that parents often choose schools not that are necessarily academically superior, but that have more children that look like their own children. That they tend to look at questions of social characteristics rather than just academics. And so that leads to greater segregation by race and class, for example, and by ability. So there's concerns that going further into a choice system will exacerbate the segregation that we already have to deal with.
When students leave public schools for charter schools or voucher schools, state funding follows. That can cause serious problems for public schools.
The last decade on the funding level has just been catastrophic for public schools. I mean, we saw some states cut public education budgets 25 to 30% during the last recession. And at the same time that they were doing that, they were doubling and quadrupling their expenditures on charter schools and private schools, right? Which goes back to this idea of moving kids off the public school budget and moving them onto some sort of private accounting sheet. And if you move enough of those kids off of the public school budget, you also fracture the political alliance to push for public education. Now, the irony is that even once the economy rebounded, public school budgets did not. Those budgets stayed flat in most instances, right? While vouchers and charters continued to expand. So we have two different trajectories there. And in fact, a full decade after the recession, roughly half of the nation's states were still spending less in real dollar terms on public education than they had before the recession, right? And that's before the pandemic.
What we have now is a situation where everybody's competing for the same pool of dollars. So we cut up a pie into many more pieces, everyone gets a sliver rather than a wholesome amount in which to be successful. And because of this, we are now putting more and more dollars into private hands, and we find the traditional public schools fighting for survival.
More and more money of that is getting stripped off to the private operations. So actual public schools are getting less and less.
For the conversation today with the choice, it really comes down to when you start losing those type of monies, that impacts programs. So where before you may have a really great arts program or a music program or a PE program, people are having to make some really hard choices. Also, the vastness of the curriculum, maybe you want to offer 7 different science classes and now you can only offer 5. And so that it really goes down to programming and access to opportunity for kids.
And I think that's maybe what the legislature doesn't understand enough of, is that when you tie that to students, when you take a number of students out, the school can't always adjust for that.
In November 2019, 15,000 teachers rallied at the Indiana State House to help the legislature understand.
It is definitely affecting Indiana education. So I definitely don't agree with it. I think that maybe at the beginning they had a good idea, but I think there's just way too much money from the public schools that is going to those charter schools and to those vouchers. Whereas if we put that money in the public schools, let's see what we can do with that.
The biggest impact of school choice has been in urban areas, where charter schools and vouchers are most heavily concentrated. In Gary, for example, more students now attend charter schools than attend local public schools. Enrollment in Gary community schools has declined by over half in the past 10 years.
School choice legislation in the minds of many parents and people across the city has made an appealing other system that they can buy into. And I think that it's compelling because they have all the tools they need to paint this picture of failure for our traditional public school system. It's a very well-designed machine of myths that we have going, and if you don't have the time or energy to sort through it, and their marketing is very slick and nice, and so it's going to take an equally well-orchestrated effort to combat that messaging in order to educate folks about the damage that has been done to public schools.
You have never seen the misuse of public education to the degree in which it exists today. And I'm telling urban school corporations they ought to file a class action lawsuit. It's criminal what they're doing to public education in the state.
It's not just urban districts that are affected by school choice.
When the whole charter school kind of movement got going, and even the vouchers, there were some legislators that were nervous about it, but they were basically told, you're out in a rural area, this is not going to affect you. This is all about urban areas, inner cities. So if you're not from Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Evansville, Gary, someplace like that, it's really not going to impact you. This is really an issue for those people. So you can vote for this and it's never going to impact you. But it's had this interesting unintended consequence, I think, even in rural areas where the rural schools are under a great deal of pressure because they're losing kids because rural area population is declining.
And if a charter school moves into a rural area, it takes them down really, really quick. Their schools are really just barely hanging on by a thread. And that's what the rural areas are fighting for, to hold those public school districts together.
Indiana school choice policies also allow students to transfer to a different public school district, regardless of where they live. That forces school districts to compete for students.
We have had the delightful, really, sighting of billboards and direct mail pieces from one public school district into the adjacent ones, bragging about test scores, bragging about touting better graduation rates, and welcoming additional students and the dollars that come with them. So we had already a strong measure of choice available to every family.
In addition to seeing families migrate to cities and suburbs, some rural districts have struggled to compete for students. Brown County schools have lost nearly 10% of their enrollment because of students transferring to nearby school districts.
In Brown County schools, really over the last 10 years, we have seen a massive decline in our student enrollment, and that happened directly at the time of legislation for choice. When you are a small and rural school, of which 75% of school districts in the state of Indiana are designated as small and rural, so 3 out of 4 school districts in the state are small and rural, choice has been really a massive detriment to the future of small and rural school districts.
Governor Daniels said the state would hold charter and voucher schools accountable for their performance. But advocates for public schools point out that charter and voucher schools aren't subject to the same rules, and they don't have to be accountable to the voting public.
The public hasn't been fully engaged to fully understand what's been done and what the impacts are. And I think that proponents of school choice have avoided having to really show that it's working, that we're actually getting some kind of better payoff, and to come to grips with the negative impacts that it has on traditional public schools.
Traditional public schools are very transparent in a lot of ways, from the reporting to board meetings, and the list goes on. For charter schools and choice schools not to be held to the same standard is really, it needs to be on the radar of a lot of citizens and questioned. I think that is a very big disservice, not only to our citizens, but to the kids who are sitting in those schools.
We know the charter schools, they're not held under the same guidelines, I would say, as public schools. They're not as accountable. You can even look at school boards, where public schools have school boards that are elected by the communities that they serve. And as constituents of a community, you can go to school boards, voice your concerns, talk about different things, actually make some help them make decisions because you're voting for them. Whereas charters, their school boards are not community members. They're members from outside the communities.
I think from 2014 to 2019, Indiana spent $1.4 billion on charter schools. And we haven't really gone back and done serious audits for those charter schools to find out where that money's being spent. It seems to me the money should be being spent on kids and education, considering it's public money.
Are charter schools public schools or private schools? They can be either. When the government provided emergency aid for the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, charter schools got money intended for public schools. But they also received money for private businesses and nonprofits, leading to allegations they were double dipping. The confusion makes it problematic to compare public schools with charter and private schools.
There is not an equal playing field when it comes to public education and choice and charter options. If we were aligned with the same rules for the game, the same accountability measures, the same expectations with standardized testing, if all of those things were aligned, I think it would be a little bit easier to compare efficacy.
If our public dollars are going to go to fund schools that are not traditional public schools, there ought to be the same accountabilities that come and the same requirements that come as far as services that are provided for those schools. I'll give you an example. It's not uncommon for us in the month of May to have students return to us as a traditional public from a choice scholarship school without the number of credits that they need to graduate. And so once that student comes back to us, because we are the school of legal settlement, they will be counted as a non-graduate for us because they have not received the credits in their choice scholarship school to be prepared to graduate. And so that then falls on our graduation rate, not on that choice scholarship school.
There is sometimes the feeling that accountability is something that public schools don't want, and that could not be farther from the truth. All of our information is on the Department of Ed website. You can see right down to how many students passed each part of the test, how many students were suspended last year, how much money we spent on every part of our budget. Public education is transparent, and we are being held accountable.
Another issue is a lack of state oversight. In January 2020, the State Board of Accounts reported that 2 online-only charter schools overbilled the state by nearly $70 million.
So we had a couple of virtual charters that we knew had problems for years. They finally got caught, but that's after fraudulently getting $68 million in funding and kind of misappropriating $100 million plus into a system of for-profit management and service companies that were attached to the original charter operator.
Businesses associated with the two virtual schools gave over $140,000 in campaign contributions to Republican office holders.
So that's kind of how the system works in Indiana. I hate to say it's a pay-to-play legislature. If we looked at it in any other system, I think it would definitely be corruption. But in our case, we call it campaign finance, and this is how the system works.
In the spring of 2020, Americans filled the streets in marches and rallies sparked by police killings of George Floyd and other African Americans. The outpouring of support for racial justice showed a hunger to build community across lines of race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, an aspiration embodied in our public schools and our democracy. In response, the National Coalition for Public Education argues that, now more than ever, as our country tries to rectify our history of racial injustice, we need to invest in our public schools that welcome all children and unite our communities, not in private schools that further divide us.
The essential principle of democracy is what we see at the polling place. Everybody's vote counts the same. And that is also the essential notion of public education. Everybody's education ought to count the same. The child ought to be revered and educated with as much care as possible in the public system. That system is at war with any notion that a school can pick and choose who to educate simply because they have the wrong race, the wrong ethnicity, the wrong gender, the wrong gender orientation, or they're blue-eyed rather than brown-eyed. It's at war with democracy. We have to have a public education system that is as democratic as our system of voting, which is, as we all believe, every vote counts, and in a democratic public school system, every child counts and should not be excluded for irrational reasons.
Our public schools have been designed to bring people together, to create a common good, right? I mean, we go back to Adams. He said, look, it's incumbent that both the wealthy and the poor go together in one school, right? That we are building this community endeavor, and it really is only public schools where we get this common experience that build, hopefully, ties that bind us beyond race, beyond religion, beyond socioeconomic status. But the private school system has a much different theory in which we can all choose our own destiny and our own values. But if we eliminate public schools, there is no longer this common set of understanding. So ultimately, the private school choice moves us into silos, right? Sort of racial, religious, and other forms of silos. So that's important.
The 1816 Constitution, our first Constitution, one of the things we really celebrate is there was a provision put in there that said there shall be education for all. Now, that was largely aspirational and really didn't pan out as a reality. But then in the second Constitution, they put some language in as well, saying we're going to have a system of public schools, and eventually that got up and running. And it's obviously critical. Eventually, I think people concluded that education could no longer be something for the elites. It couldn't be something that just the upper class had, that we needed to have everyone educated if you're going to have a functioning full democracy.
Indiana's current constitution, dating from 1851, calls for a system of common schools in the belief that knowledge and learning are, quote, essential to the preservation of free government. But school choice changes how we think about education. Instead of a public good, it becomes a private resource.
I often talk about the games that people play. The Republicans played a game on the state of Indiana. The Republicans indicated that they wanted to help these poor, impoverished kids that weren't performing. But instead, it was an effort to get their foot in the door with privatization of public education. And we know that it has blossomed.
I think if someone wants to choose something, that's fine. But I think we've got to acknowledge and be far more upfront than anyone has bothered to be who advocates for privatization, that this isn't about choice. This is about cost reduction. This is about really anti-choice, because 90% of our America's students, and same thing in the state of Indiana, still go to public school. They choose to go to public school. And they choose to go for all kinds of very, very positive reasons. So that the choice that is made is certainly up to the individual. But the choice that is made by those who perpetrate choice education is a choice that democracy can't afford.
As I began to get involved in issues that impacted public education and encountered families who had their children in public schools, and learned what my choice to accept vouchers were doing to public schools by helping to create an environment of underfunding, helping to create an environment where schools were being under-resourced. I could not in good conscience continue to take away from another student's potential. The concept of the common good is almost extinct in a way, or it's there are attempts to make it extinct, because we're abolishing that ideology for a corporate ideology.
We know that until we can get our public schools back, our communities are not going to thrive like they did back when I was in school.
Public education is wonderful. It teaches them all about life. It's not just about the academics, it's about life in general, and learning and being around different types of people. And they're getting so much from what in a public education that they're not getting in these smaller private schools. The world's not like a small private school. The world's like a public school. And they need to learn all those types of skills they're learning in the classroom every day.
We have to take care of our public institutions. That's where our students are exposed to inclusionary practices. That's where we're exposed to being good citizens and understanding a democracy. That's where that foundation starts, and that's where it lies.
When I think about the democracy and I think about our state constitution, and we have a constitutional obligation to educate every single child. The state of Indiana does, for free. Let me say that, right? We're committed to doing that. But what I'm seeing is that those tax dollars that we're investing in our education are starting to be diverted to more private interest.
Vouchers and charter schools were supposed to offer a better alternative to public schools, but they have contributed to a winner-take-all approach that's at odds with the purpose of public education.
When you look back at the creation of public schools in America, it was designed to be a school that served the local community, that was reflective of the local community's values, that the decisions were made by those who were elected or appointed to those positions, and it was meant to be available for all. It is my desire and my true hope that before the end of my career, that I will see a shifting tide in the state of Indiana by which we can all work towards educating all of our Indiana children, and that we can break down some of these barriers that have been created over the last 10 to 15 years by some of the policies that have been put into place, by some of the reform that has been enacted, so that we can truly work together, pool our resources together, so that we can make this state even greater. This is a state that works, so let's get there. Let's make sure it does.
Our greatest natural resource in this country is not the rolling waters of the Midwest or the oil and coal that we extract from the earth or the gold that we place in depositories. Our greatest natural resource is our people. And America is not investing in its people the way it ought to. And America is going to pay for this lack of investment.
One of the great success stories of public education is how when we had immigration, right, during that period of time, how successful our public education system allowed to sort of welcome folks who were speaking languages that were not our own, and yet successfully educated, and then ultimately allowed for a citizenry that was giving back, right, to society, and kind of all of these ideals were realized. So that when we separate, right, we are breaking down those ideals, and I worry that this model is doing that. I think it might be unintended, and so now that we know it's happening, we need to do something about it.
Unfortunately, education has entered a political domain that it has never before seen. And if we want it to survive for our children and for the next generation, and the way that it has survived for generation after generation for the last 200 years, we have to fight. And what we're fighting for is not just our schools. It is ultimately, as I began this conversation, we are fighting for the soul and foundation of our democracy.
So here we are, standing at a crossroads. From the beginning, public schools in the United States were created as institutions intended to bring citizens together. Public schools were to be the foundation of our democracy. The new nation's system of schooling was meant to provide the experiences and learning necessary to create contributing members of a democratic society, citizens who could work to create the common good for all. The idea of the common good has long played a central role in the conduct of our public life. When we U.S. citizens, and those we elect to represent us, discuss the shared standards of living in our communities, whether local, state, or national, we address our common good. Whether we talk of roads and highways, the quality of air and water, our national defense and freedom of speech, or the schools our children attend, we are talking about the common good, and we are talking about the good of all citizens. Any education that purports to be truly public must be grounded in equity and equality. In recent years, unfortunately, policies have undermined the core belief that public schools are a cornerstone of democracy, that they should unite communities, not divide them. While their proponents sometimes use the language of equity and racial justice, these policies divert resources from public schools, the institutions that must serve everyone. In Indiana, for example, the school voucher movement known as the Indiana Choice Scholarship Program has, since its creation in 2011, increasingly worked to rob public schools of students and funding. Despite its self-description, the choice movement has consistently failed to help children, especially those who need it the most. Tens of millions of taxpayer dollars have been leached away and handed to schools that have been given the license to discriminate. But wasn't the legality of racial discrimination overthrown by the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruling way back in 1954? It was, but discrimination proved to be a moving target. In the wake of the Brown decision, public funding made possible the creation of all-white segregation academies. And public funding in the form of vouchers has also allowed private schools to discriminate on the grounds of religion and sexuality and disability. Today, we know we must invest in and improve our public schools to move them closer to fulfilling the promise of equity and equality. At the same time, we find ourselves facing the need to protect our system of public education from those who believe our schools should be privatized and turned into profit centers. In such a system, justice is only a marketing ploy, and the common good loses its meaning. In an equitable world, schools of any kind that take public funds would be required to play by the same rules as public schools, period. So-called choice policies hollow out a core democratic institution, our public schools, and increase discrimination and segregation. That is just plain wrong. Schooling in America must always be of the people, by the people, and for all the people.